She stood in the middle of a courthouse with her wrists bound by rope, not because she was dangerous, but because nobody wanted her. Her own uncle had dragged her there like livestock to market, offering her to strangers in exchange for nothing more than the trouble of keeping her alive. One by one, every man in that room looked at her and turned away. And when the last bid fell silent, the judge raised his gavel and said the words that should have broken her completely. "Free of charge. Anyone?" Nobody moved. Then the door opened. If this story moves you, stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning Evelyn Hart was sold, or rather, the morning nobody bothered to buy her, began the way most of the worst mornings in her life had begun, with her uncle's voice cutting through the dark before the sun had any business being up. Get dressed. Something decent if you own it. She didn't own much of anything. That was part of the problem. Evelyn was 24 years old, broad-shouldered, and tall enough that she had spent most of her adult life learning to make herself smaller in doorways, at tables, in conversations. She had her mother's dark brown eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had inherited exactly nothing else from either of them because both were dead. Her mother 3 years gone from a fever that swept through the valley without apology. Her father 18 months after that from what the doctor called heart failure, and what Evelyn privately believed was grief. After that, there was only Uncle Gerald. Gerald Hart was not a cruel man in the way that novels describe cruelty. He wasn't dramatic about it. He didn't shout often or raise his fist unless he'd been drinking past midnight. What he was, in the plainest and most honest terms, was a man who saw other people primarily as problems to be managed or resources to be used, and Evelyn had fallen firmly into the first category the day her parents' land transferred into his name. For 2 years she had cooked his meals, mended his fences, hauled water when the well pump seized, and slept in a room barely large enough to turn around in. She hadn't complained. Complaining had never served her well. But Gerald, who had a talent for finding the bottom of whiskey bottles and the ears of men who owed him favors, had apparently spent those same 2 years arriving at a conclusion. She was more trouble than she was worth. "Move," he said, appearing in her doorway with his hat already on and his coat buttoned wrong at the collar. He didn't look at her directly. He rarely did anymore. "We're riding into town." "What for?" "Business." That was all he said. That was all he ever said. Blackstone Ridge wasn't a large town, but it had opinions about itself that exceeded its size. It had a general store, a livery, a church with a bell that only rang on Sundays, a saloon that stayed open regardless of the day, and a courthouse that doubled as the county's official location for land disputes, debt hearings, and what the locals cheerfully called arrangement proceedings, which was the polite term for what happened when a person became, through death or debt or simple misfortune, someone else's legal responsibility to dispose of. Evelyn did not know, as the wagon rolled down the main road and she watched the shop fronts pass in the thin November light, that she was the business Gerald had in mind. She found out when he tied the wagon outside the courthouse and told her to get down. "Gerald, I said get down." Inside, the courthouse smelled like pipe smoke and old wood. There were perhaps 30 people already gathered, men mostly, a few women near the back walls, some she recognized and some she didn't. Judge Harlan Pruitt sat at the front behind his wide oak desk, a heavy-set man with white side whiskers, and the permanently impatient expression of someone who believed his time was more valuable than anyone else's in any room. Gerald walked her to the front. It was only when one of the men near the window, Billy Crane, she recognized him. He bought grain from her father once. Snorted a laugh into his sleeve that Evelyn understood something was deeply wrong. "Gerald," she kept her voice low. "What is this?" "Quiet. What is this?" He turned to her then, and his expression was not angry. It was something worse than angry. It was simply finished. The look of a man who has been carrying something inconvenient and has finally located a place to put it down. "You're 24 years old and you're my responsibility," he said. "I can't afford that anymore. So Judge Pruitt is going to help find you a new situation." "A new—" She stopped. She understood. "You're giving me away. I'm finding you a placement." "That is the same thing." "Evelyn." His voice dropped, and for just a moment something flickered behind his eyes. Discomfort, maybe. Or the ghost of conscience. Then it was gone. This is the practical solution. Don't make a scene. She wanted to make a scene. She felt it rise in her chest like pressure behind a dam. The scream, the fury, the absolute white-hot injustice of being 24 years old and being handed off like a piece of furniture nobody had room for. But she had learned, over many years of needing things from people who didn't want to give them, that screaming accomplished nothing except making people more determined to be rid of you. So she stood still. Judge Pruitt cleared his throat. Right, let's proceed. What followed was the most humiliating 45 minutes of Evelyn Hart's life, which was saying something, because the competition for that title had never been weak. Gerald had apparently arranged with Judge Pruitt to conduct what the judge described in his droning official voice as a voluntary household placement proceeding, which translated in the language of plain reality to standing Evelyn at the front of the room while men who needed household help looked her over and decided whether she was worth their time. They tied her wrists. She hadn't expected that. One of the court's appointed men, a deputy whose name she didn't know and whose face she would not forget, produced a length of rope and looped it around her wrists with the businesslike efficiency of someone who had done this before. He wasn't rough about it. That was almost worse somehow. He was just routine about it, as though this were an ordinary Tuesday, which she supposed, for him, it was. She stood at the front of the room with her hands bound and let the proceeding begin because there was nothing else to do. The first man to approach was a farmer from outside town named Morton Webb. He walked around her once, the way a person examines a draft horse, then looked at Gerald. "She cook?" "Well enough," Gerald said. "She strong?" "Strong enough to be useful." Morton looked at Evelyn's height, her broad frame, her hands. He squinted. "She's a big woman," he said, as though this were a fault in construction. "She's a hard worker," Gerald said. Morton grunted. He opened his mouth as though to make a bid, then seemed to reconsider, and shook his head. "Too much to feed," he said, and stepped back into the crowd. Someone near the back laughed. A short bark of a sound, quickly muffled. The second man, she didn't catch his name, only that he had red hands and smelled of pipe tobacco, came forward, looked at her for approximately 10 seconds, and said, "Not what I had in mind," before turning away. The third was worse. A younger man, maybe 30, who looked at her with undisguised contempt and said, loudly enough for the room to hear, "You expect someone to take that? She'd eat half the winter stores just standing still." The room responded to this with the sound that rooms make when they've been given permission to find something funny that they were already thinking. Not everyone laughed. Maybe 10 people out of 30. But 10 people laughing in a small room is more than enough sound to fill it. Evelyn fixed her eyes on a point on the far wall, a water stain near the window frame, roughly the shape of a boot, and breathed evenly and did not cry. Crying would not help. Crying in front of these people would only make it worse, and she refused to give them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart in their courthouse on a Tuesday morning. More men came forward. More men stepped back. One made a token offer so low that Judge Pruitt actually shook his head. Another began a bid, caught the expression of the men around him, and let the number die in his throat. The women near the back wall were quiet. A few of them looked at the floor. Gerald stood to the side with his arms crossed, and Evelyn, glancing at him once, saw something on his face that she didn't have a word for. Not guilt. She wouldn't give him that much. More like the specific discomfort of a man who has committed himself to a thing and is discovering mid-action that it feels worse than he anticipated, but is too stubborn to admit it. She looked away from him. She looked back at her water stain. 20 minutes in, Judge Pruitt cleared his throat again, a sound like gravel shifting. "We don't appear to have any serious interest at this point," he said, in the tone of a man reporting mildly disappointing weather. "Given the circumstances, I'm prepared to declare the placement at no cost to any willing party. Anyone willing to take on Miss Hart's household provision at zero financial exchange?" Silence. Not an uncertain silence. A finished silence. The kind that settles when everyone in a room has already made their decision and is simply waiting for someone to name it out loud. Evelyn's chest felt like it was filling with cold water. She had known she would leave here without Gerald. She had understood, in the walk from the wagon to the courtroom door, that today was the day her life changed whether she chose it or not. But she had not fully understood, until this moment, what it would feel like to stand in a room full of people and hear nothing, not a single voice, not one. Judge Pruitt raised his gavel, and then the door at the back of the courthouse opened. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of the door, heavy oak, old hinges, swinging open with the deliberate weight of someone who opens doors without wondering whether they'll be welcome on the other side. Then boots on the wooden floor, slow steps, not hurrying, not performing. The crowd shifted. Men near the back stepped sideways, not because they were asked, but because something in the size and stillness of the man entering made them want to give him room. He was tall, genuinely, considerably tall, the kind of tall that isn't unusual on the frontier, but that still registers in a person's body before their mind catches up. Dark coat, trail-worn, a beard cut short but not carefully, hands at his sides, eyes moving across the room with the flat, deliberate assessment of a man who had spent years in places where reading a situation quickly was not a preference, but a survival habit. Evelyn didn't know him. Nobody in the room seemed entirely comfortable with the fact that he was in it. He stopped near the middle of the aisle. His eyes moved from Judge Pruitt to Gerald to Evelyn, and they stayed on Evelyn. "This the Hart proceeding?" he said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Judge Pruitt set his gavel down. "It is. And you are?" "Gideon Ashcroft." Something moved through the room at the name. Not recognition exactly. More like the particular alertness that happens when a name arrives that people have heard before and have feelings about. Evelyn caught pieces of it. A quick look exchanged between two men near the window, a woman near the wall who pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. She didn't know what the name meant. She filed it away. "Mr. Ashcroft," Judge Pruitt said carefully, "we're in the final stages of a placement proceeding. Miss Hart is being offered at no cost to any willing party." "I heard." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, set it on the nearest bench. "I'll take her." The room did not respond immediately. It processed. Then someone, the young man from earlier, the one with the loud opinion about winter stores, laughed, short, disbelieving. "You're serious?" the young man said. "You rode down here for that?" Gideon Ashcroft looked at the young man with an expression that was not threatening in any theatrical sense. It was simply level, patient. The look of a man who has encountered worse than a loud stranger in a courthouse and survived those encounters without much difficulty. The young man stopped laughing. Gideon walked to the front of the room. He didn't look at Evelyn again yet. He looked at Gerald. "She have belongings?" Gerald blinked. "A trunk. Back of my wagon." "I'll collect it." He looked at Judge Pruitt. "Papers?" Judge Pruitt, who appeared to be navigating the situation primarily by instinct, assembled the appropriate documents with the speed of a man who senses that things will go more smoothly if they move quickly. Gideon signed where indicated in the plain, unhurried hand of someone who has filled out enough frontier paperwork to find no ceremony in it. Then he turned to Evelyn. Up close, he was older than she'd initially placed him. Mid-30s, maybe, or the frontier version of mid-30s, which aged differently than towns did. There were lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with smiling. His jaw was set, not angry, but contained, the way a man looks when he has made a decision and is done questioning it. He looked at her wrists, at the rope. He reached into his belt, produced a short folding knife, and cut the rope in 2 clean strokes. He didn't make a production of it. He put the knife away. "I'm Gideon Ashcroft," he said. Not introducing himself for her benefit exactly, more like establishing a starting point. "I've got a cabin about 14 miles into the North Range. It's a hard ride. You'll need a coat." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Her wrists were still together by habit, even though the rope was gone. "I have one," she said. "Good." He picked up the folded paper from the bench without looking back at the room. "We'll leave in an hour. Get your trunk." He walked toward the door. Nobody said anything. Evelyn stood at the front of the courtroom for a moment, alone now, officially, in the new sense of the word, and looked at the room one last time. The men near the window, the women near the wall, Gerald standing to the side with his arms no longer crossed, his expression finally showing something that might have been regret, though she was not inclined to care much about that. She thought about saying something sharp and final. The kind of thing that lives forever in the memory of the person who says it and the people who hear it. But she was 24 years old, and she was tired, and she didn't actually believe that sharp final words changed anything. She walked to the door. The trunk was lighter than it should have been, considering it contained the entirety of her life. 2 dresses, one better than the other. A wool coat, worn thin at the elbows. A small tin box that held her mother's ring, the only thing Gerald hadn't found useful to sell. A book of pressed wildflowers that she'd kept since she was 12, for no practical reason she could name. Gideon loaded it onto his horse, a large bay animal that stood with the patient solidity of a creature that had been many places and was rarely surprised by new ones, without comment. "You ride?" he asked. "Not well." "You'll ride behind me then." He swung up and shifted forward, making space. "It's 14 miles. Hold on." She looked at the horse. She looked at the distance between the stirrup and the saddle. "I'm heavy," she said. Not self-pity, just logistics. The horse was big but not enormous, and she was not a small woman. And 14 miles was 14 miles. Gideon looked at her, then at the horse. "Samson's carried elk and timber both in the same trip," he said. "He'll manage." She took the stirrup, pulled herself up, settled behind the saddle on the bedroll he had strapped there, which was perhaps not accidental. They rode north out of Blackstone Ridge without speaking. Evelyn looked back once. The courthouse roof, the main street, a town that had gathered to watch her be disposed of, and had mostly succeeded. She faced forward and watched the mountains come closer. She didn't know yet what waited for her in those mountains. She didn't know who Gideon Ashcroft was, what his name meant to the people in that room. What had moved a man from the North Range to ride into Blackstone Ridge on a November morning and sign papers for a woman nobody else would take. She had her coat and her trunk and a ring that had belonged to her mother and a man's back to hold on to in the cold. It was more than she'd had 3 hours ago. She held on. The cabin appeared through the tree line just before the light failed completely, and Evelyn's first thought was that it looked like something that had given up. Not collapsed. It was still standing, which counted for something. But it had the particular exhausted lean of a structure that had been fighting the weather for years without anyone paying much attention to the fight. One shutter hung crooked off its hinge on the left window. The porch steps had a gap where a board had rotted through and never been replaced. The chimney needed repointing. The woodpile beside the north wall was adequate, but not what it should be heading into a mountain winter. And Evelyn, who had spent 2 years managing Gerald's property with insufficient help and insufficient funds, could read a homestead's problems the way some people read words on a page. She read this one in about 30 seconds. Gideon swung down from Samson and looped the reins over the porch rail. He didn't apologize for the state of the place. He just looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at a thing he's stopped seeing because he's been too close to it for too long. "It needs work," he said. "I can see that. There's a room at the back. It was—" He stopped, started again. "It's empty. You can have it." She climbed down from behind the saddle, her legs stiff from the cold and the ride, and stood in the dirt yard looking at the cabin. The temperature had dropped significantly in the last hour. Her breath was visible. The mountains behind the tree line were already invisible in the dark. "Is there firewood inside?" she asked. "Some." "Then let's start there." The room at the back was small and cold and smelled like disuse. That particular combination of dust and closed air that settles into a space when nobody has breathed in it for a long time. There was a narrow bed frame with a rope mattress, a washstand with a cracked basin, and a window that faced east and would catch the morning light, which was something, at least. Evelyn set her trunk at the foot of the bed and looked around. She'd slept in worse. The room at Gerald's house had been smaller and had smelled like mice. This room had potential. She went back to the main room where Gideon had built up the fire, methodically, no wasted movement, and was now standing at the far end of the room near the table, seeming uncertain about what to do with himself in his own house, which was, she was beginning to notice, a recurring condition for him. He was comfortable in motion. Stillness seemed to cost him something. "Is there food?" she asked. "Salted venison, some dried beans, cornmeal." "I'll cook." He looked at her. "You don't need to do that tonight." "I'm hungry," she said plainly. "I assume you are too, so I'll cook." He didn't argue. She found the provisions where he indicated, organized with the efficiency of a man who lives alone and needs to locate things in the dark, and started a pot of beans with the venison and what seasonings he had, which were limited but not nothing. She found dried sage and a half-empty tin of salt, and a bundle of something she didn't immediately recognize until she smelled it, and then added it anyway because it was better than nothing. Gideon sat at the table. He didn't watch her exactly, but he didn't look away either, in the careful, peripheral way of a man who is paying attention without wanting to be caught at it. They ate without much conversation. The beans weren't remarkable. They'd needed to soak properly and hadn't had the time, but they were hot. And hot was the most important quality in food on a November night at elevation. "It's better than what I usually manage," Gideon said, when the bowls were nearly empty. Evelyn wasn't sure if that was a compliment or just a statement of fact. With him, she was beginning to understand the difference wasn't always clear. He said what he meant and apparently expected the same in return, which was either a quality she would come to appreciate or find exhausting, and she hadn't decided yet. "The beans needed longer," she said. "Tomorrow, they'll be better." He nodded and pushed back from the table and took both bowls to the wash basin without being asked, which was not nothing, she noted. It was a small thing, but small things were frequently the most accurate measurement of a person. "I don't know what you expect from me," she said. He turned from the basin. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't know what you expect. You signed the papers. You brought me here. I don't know what the arrangement is supposed to look like." He was quiet for a moment. He dried his hands on a cloth hanging from the basin stand and seemed to be choosing words with the care of someone who had spent a long time not bothering to choose them and was out of practice. "I don't expect anything," he said finally. "I needed help with the homestead. That's the honest answer. It's too much for one person in winter, and I've been—" Another pause. "I've been letting things go." "I can see that." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the recognition that she was going to say what she saw and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. And he wasn't sure yet whether to be annoyed or relieved by it. "The room is yours," he said. "You can leave whenever you want. I won't stop you, but if you stay and help manage the place, you'll have food and shelter, and I'll try to—" He looked like a man who had run out of practiced words and was now improvised. "I'll try to make it reasonable." "Reasonable," she repeated. "Yes." It was not, by any measure, a warm offer. It was the offer of a man who was accustomed to making arrangements rather than connections, who saw a practical problem and had arrived at a practical solution and was not particularly comfortable with the parts in between. But it was honest, and honesty was something Evelyn had been starved of long enough that she could recognize it even in the bluntest form. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." He nodded once and went to bank the fire for the night. She went to her room and lay on the rope mattress with her coat over her and listened to the mountain wind working at the corners of the cabin, and thought that this was either the beginning of something or the continuation of nothing, and that she wouldn't know which for a while yet. The days settled into a rhythm that was not comfortable exactly, but was functional, which was closer to comfort than Evelyn had experienced in years. She woke before Gideon most mornings, not because she was particularly a morning person, but because the mountain cold made staying in the narrow bed increasingly untenable past a certain hour, and built the fire back up and started whatever she'd planned for breakfast. He rose maybe 20 minutes later, dressed with the quick efficiency of a man who had never spent time thinking about clothes, and went out to see to Samson and check whatever needed checking before the day proper started. They crossed paths at the table twice a day, sometimes 3 times if the weather pushed him back inside earlier than planned. In the first week, he said little. She said little. The silence between them was not hostile, but it was dense. The packed kind of silence that exists between two people who are both carrying things they haven't offered to one another yet and aren't sure they mean to. She fixed the broken porch step on the 4th day because she walked through the gap first thing in the morning and her foot went down 6 inches further than expected, and she swore, genuinely, sharply, not a ladylike word, and then went and found the lumber pile and the tools in the lean-to beside the woodshed and fixed it before noon because she was not going to fall through a porch step twice. Gideon came back at midday to find her finishing the last nail. He stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at the step, then at her. "You can use my tools," he said. "I already did." "I know, I mean, in the future. If something needs fixing, you don't have to wait for me." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. What needs fixing in this place could fill a list. He looked at the cabin wall, at the shutter, still hanging crooked, at the gap in the porch railing that she hadn't gotten to yet. "I know," he said. and he sounded tired when he said it. Not the physical tiredness of labor, but the heavier kind. The tiredness of a man who has been looking at a deteriorating thing for a long time and has lacked either the will or the reason to address it. She didn't push. She'd learned in the second week that pushing Gideon Ashcroft produced the same result as pushing a stone wall. Not injury exactly, but also not progress. He moved at his own pace toward things, which was infuriating when she needed him to move faster and occasionally useful when she needed him to stay put. She got up, put the hammer back, and went to start on the shutter. It was somewhere in the third week that the cabin began, almost without either of them intending it, to change. Evelyn found a way to hang the remaining pots so they weren't stacked in a precarious column that clattered every time someone walked past. She sealed the draft under the back room door with a strip of cloth tacked along the bottom, which made her room warm enough to sleep without the coat over her blanket. She found a broom that had been relegated to the corner of the lean-to, apparently retired from active duty, and reinstated it. Gideon, for his part, surprised her. She came in from hanging wash on the line one afternoon, the temperatures still permitted it in the weak afternoon sun, and found him at the table with a length of timber and a hand plane, working at something with the particular focused stillness that was, she was learning, his version of contentment. He didn't look up. "What is that?" she asked. "Chair? We have chairs. Not ones that fit." She stood still for a moment. On the far side of the room, the two existing chairs were a matched set, narrow, straight-backed, built with the dimensions of someone considerably smaller than her in mind. She had been using the one that wobbled less, and had spent 3 weeks unconsciously adjusting her posture to accommodate it without ever naming the problem out loud. He had noticed anyway. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She wasn't sure what to say. Nobody had ever built her furniture before. Nobody had ever looked at what wasn't quite working for her and quietly gone to fix it. "You don't have to do that," she said finally. "It's not done yet," he said, which was not an answer to what she'd said, but was perhaps an answer to something else. She went to hang her coat and didn't look at him again for a minute, and by the time she turned back around, she had her face sorted into its regular arrangement. "The legs need to be even," she said. "The other chairs both lean." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm making a new one." The chair was finished 4 days later. It was plain. He wasn't a decorative craftsman. Everything he made had the honest functionality of a man who built for use rather than admiration. But it was solidly made and the right size, and when she sat in it for the first time, it didn't rock, and her feet reached the floor properly, and she felt something so close to dignity that she had to look at the fire for a moment so he wouldn't see her face. "It's good," she said. He shrugged. "Wasn't complicated." "Still." He looked at her briefly, then away. "You cook well," he said, as if this balanced something. "Better than I do. Better than most people I know." She snorted. "That is the most sideways compliment I've ever received." "I didn't mean it sideways." "I know you didn't," she said. "That's what makes it funny." He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read. Not confusion exactly, more like someone encountering a kind of humor they haven't had directed at them in a long time, and are slightly uncertain how to respond to. Then, slowly, something relaxed at the corners of his eyes. Not a laugh, but adjacent to one. It was, she thought, a start. The town came up once, about a month in. Gideon needed to ride down to the general store for a few provisions and asked, in the practical way he asked most things, whether she needed anything while he was making the trip. "Thread," she said. "Black, if they have it. Brown, if not." He nodded and was pulling his coat on when she said, "People in the courthouse, they knew your name." He stopped. "I don't know what it means," she said. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself. I just noticed." He stood with one arm in his coat and one arm out, looking at the middle distance between them. "I've been in the mountains a long time," he said. "People make up stories about men they don't see often. Most of it isn't true. Some of it is." "Which parts are true?" He finished putting on his coat. "I've done things I'm not proud of. I've also done things people assumed were worse than they were." He reached for his hat. "I'm not dangerous to you. That's what matters right now." She considered him. "I know that," she said. "I've been here a month." He looked at her. "How do you know?" Because a dangerous man wouldn't have built me a chair, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hat on and opened the door. Black thread, he said. I'll remember. She heard him cross the porch and descend the newly repaired steps, and she went back to what she was doing, but she was thinking about what he'd said. Some of it is true, and what he hadn't said, which was everything else. He was back before dark, which was faster than she'd expected. He set a wrapped package on the table without comment. She unwrapped it later and found black thread and brown thread both, and also a small tin of the dried sage she'd nearly run out of 2 weeks ago. She put the tin in the provision shelf beside the others and told herself that it was a practical purchase and meant nothing in particular. She almost believed it. November hardened into December with very little ceremony. The mountains announced winter the way they announced most things. Not gradually, but all at once, as if they'd been waiting for permission and had finally received it. Snow came overnight with serious intent, 4 inches by morning and still falling when Evelyn opened the door and looked out at a world that had gone white and very quiet. She stood in the doorway in her coat and watched it for a moment. Behind her, she heard Gideon come in from checking the woodpile. Storm's settling in, he said. Maybe 2, 3 days. We have enough wood? Just enough. I should have laid more in October. He said it flatly, without self-pity, the way he acknowledged most of his own failures, as logistical facts rather than moral ones. I can help carry, she said. Already done. I brought the last of the split timber in before you were up. She turned from the door. You could have woken me. It was early. So? He looked at her. He still did this sometimes. Looked at her when she pushed back, like he was recalibrating something. She'd noticed that he treated her the way he might treat a person he respected but wasn't yet entirely sure of, which she supposed was accurate. Next time, he said. I'll wake you. She nodded and went to start breakfast. The snow kept falling. They spent the day mostly indoors. He worked on a second chair without being asked, which she pretended not to notice, and she mended everything in the cabin that had been quietly waiting to be mended, working through a stack of clothes and linens that clearly hadn't seen proper attention in a long time. That evening, the wind picked up and the temperature outside dropped past the point where it stopped being uncomfortable and started being dangerous. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, and Gideon drank coffee, and Evelyn did not drink coffee because he only had enough for 1 cup's worth per day, and he'd made it clear, on the first week, that he was not someone who functioned well in the mornings without it, which she took as a reasonable limitation. She was reading. She'd found a small stack of books in a crate near the back wall, apparently left to age in the company of dust and indifference. And he was looking at the fire, and the silence between them now was not the packed kind it had been in the first week. It had loosened. It had become, somewhere in the past month, something closer to comfortable. Can I ask you something? She said, without looking up from the page. Probably. Why did you come to town that day? Specifically that day, I mean. You didn't know what was happening. He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. He was still watching the fire. I had business at the store, he said. Saw the crowd heading into the courthouse and followed to see what was happening. He paused. Stood in the back for about 10 minutes. And then? He set his cup down on the arm of the chair. And then I'd heard enough. She looked at him. His face in the firelight was not easy to read, it rarely was. But something in it was quiet in a way that wasn't his usual silence. Quieter than that. You could have left, she said. I could have, he agreed. Why didn't you? He picked up the cup again, seemed to consider the question with the same care he gave everything that mattered. I've seen a lot of things on this frontier I didn't do anything about, he said. I got tired of adding to the list. The fire shifted and threw a new pattern of light across the room. Outside, the wind hit the north wall with a sound like something large pressing against it, testing. Evelyn looked back at her book. She read the same sentence 3 times without absorbing a single word. Thank you, she said quietly. He didn't say anything for a moment. Don't thank me yet, he said. Winter hasn't started. She almost smiled. I thought this was winter. This, he said, looking toward the sound of the wind, is just the introduction. He had been right about the introduction. What came after was not an introduction. What came after was the real thing. Weeks of cold that settled into the bones of the cabin and stayed there. snow that accumulated in drifts against the north wall, until the window on that side went gray with it. Wind that found every imperfection in the chinking between the logs, and pushed through in thin cold streams that Evelyn tracked down and stuffed with rags and strips of old wool until the cabin held its heat with something approaching reliability. They fell into the winter together the way people fall into most necessary things. Not gracefully, not without friction, but persistently. Gideon went out most mornings to check his trap lines in the near range, came back by midday if the weather held, later if it didn't. Evelyn managed the cabin and the provisions and the fire, and when the weather permitted, she went with him sometimes to the closer lines because 4 hands were faster than 2, and because she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she preferred the cold open air to the interior of the cabin on the days when the walls felt like they were leaning inward. She was discovering, a person built for small spaces. The trap lines weren't what she'd expected. She'd imagined something cruder, the work of a man living at the edge of things by choice or by failure. But Gideon moved through the forest with the precision of someone who had spent years learning a landscape until it had become a kind of language. He knew which draws held rabbits in early winter, and which were empty by the first hard freeze. He knew where the marten ran and where they didn't and why, and when she asked him to explain it, he did, without condescension, as if the information were simply useful, and she were simply a person who might use it. "You know this land well," she said one morning, on the trail back to the cabin with 2 rabbits and the better part of a bobcat pelt. "I've had time to learn it. How long have you been up here?" He shifted the pack on his back. 6 years. She didn't push further that day, but she stored the number the way she was quietly storing many things about him. The way he always checked the window latch before sleeping, the way he never sat with his back to the door, the way he sometimes went quiet mid-sentence, as if he'd walked into a memory he hadn't intended to enter and needed a moment to walk back out. 6 years was a long time to be alone in mountains. Something had driven him there. She didn't know what yet. She was learning to be patient about it. The morning the real trouble started was a Thursday in the second week of January, which she knew because she had begun keeping a rough calendar scratched onto a piece of board she'd nailed beside the wash basin. Something to maintain the shape of time in a place where the sameness of winter days made the weeks blur into each other. The sky that morning had a look she hadn't seen before, not the flat gray of ordinary snow weather. Something yellower in it, a sickly cast to the light that made the snow on the ground look less white than usual, almost greenish, which made no sense but was undeniably there. She mentioned it at breakfast. "There's something wrong with the light outside," she said. Gideon looked up from his coffee and then went to the door and opened it and stood there for a moment looking at the sky. She watched his face from across the room. Something in it changed. The easy containment he usually wore shifted into something sharper. "That's a bad sky," he said. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I need to check the upper lines today before it closes in." He came back inside and set his cup down and started pulling on his heavier coat, the one he reserved for serious weather she'd noticed. Not the everyday riding coat, but the longer one with the double-layered front. "When will you be back?" "Before dark. By 4 at the latest." He picked up his pack. "If it turns before then, I'll shelter at the line cabin and come back in the morning. Don't go looking for me if I'm not back by dark." Evelyn looked at him. "The line cabin. You told me about it before. The one at the upper east draw? That's the one." He checked his belt, checked the knife, checked his pack with the quick inventory of a man who had learned that forgetting things at altitude had specific and unpleasant consequences. "It's solid. I've weathered worse up there than whatever this is." "You don't sound entirely sure of that." He paused with his hand on the door, looked at her with that level expression she'd come to know well enough to read the layers under it. "Stay inside," he said. "Keep the fire. Don't use more wood than you need because I haven't gotten to the far stack yet. And if this goes long, I know how to manage a fire, Gideon. I know you do." He opened the door. Cold came in immediately, sharp and purposeful. "I'll be back before dark." He crossed the porch. She watched him from the window as he saddled Samson with quick practiced hands, mounted, and rode north into the tree line without looking back. The sky above the trees was the color of old bone. By noon, the storm had announced itself properly, not with the gradual buildup of a normal snow system, more like a door opening, something that had been waiting on the other side of the mountains deciding it was done waiting. The wind came first, hard enough to shake the shutter she'd fixed 3 times now and would apparently need to fix a fourth. Then the snow, horizontal and serious, reducing visibility from the window to maybe 30 feet before the world became a moving white wall. Evelyn kept the fire and managed the provisions and told herself he'd said before dark. It was nowhere near dark. She mended a pair of his work trousers that had a tear along the left knee. The tear of a man who had knelt on something uneven and hadn't mentioned it. She recounted the remaining cornmeal and estimated the weeks it would carry. She checked the woodpile inside and calculated it against what she knew of the storm's apparent intention. She was not, she decided, a woman who was good at waiting. At 2 in the afternoon, with the storm showing no sign of losing interest in itself, she went to the window again and looked north toward the tree line. Nothing visible. 30 feet of white and then nothing. He'd said not to go looking if he wasn't back by dark. He wasn't supposed to need to say that. He was supposed to be back. She went back to the fire. At 3, she built the fire higher than she needed to, which she knew she shouldn't do given what he'd said about the woodpile, but which she did anyway because the bigger fire made the cabin feel less like a place where she was alone. At 4, the light outside, already diminished by the storm, dropped toward the specific gray that meant the real dark was an hour away. She stood at the window. She thought about what he'd said. Shelter at the line cabin and come back in the morning. It was the practical answer. It was what any sensible person would do. The Upper East Draw was maybe 3 miles above the cabin, and the line cabin there was solid. He'd said so. He knew this land in the dark as well as most men knew it in daylight. He was probably there right now, dry, sheltered, waiting out the storm with the practical patience he applied to everything. She thought about that. Then she thought about the sky that morning, the yellow light, and the way his face had changed when he saw it, and the specific way he'd said by 4 at the latest. Not casually, but with the deliberate precision of a man setting a number he believed in. It was past 4. She found the rope coiled on the peg near the back door. Heavy, braided rope. 40 feet of it she'd seen him use for the sledge when he hauled timber. She tied one end to the iron ring set in the wall beside the door, the ring she'd always assumed was for hanging things from, and which she now understood might have been installed for this exact reason, by someone who had learned the hard way that blizzards and landmarks looked the same when the snow came sideways. She put on every layer she owned, her coat, her heaviest wool shawl underneath it, her thickest stockings, her boots, her gloves. She wrapped a length of spare cloth around her face and neck, leaving only her eyes clear. She tied the rope around her waist. She opened the door. The storm came in like something that had been waiting for the invitation. Snow drove into the cabin in a horizontal sheet. The temperature outside was not the cold of discomfort. It was the cold of consequence, the kind that had killed experienced men who knew better than to be in it. She stepped out onto the porch. The porch railing was already buried. She could see the first 3 feet of the yard and then nothing, just moving white, textured and violent and relentlessly loud. The trees were invisible. North was a direction she had to find by memory because there was nothing out there to see. She walked. The rope played out behind her as she moved north across the yard, one hand keeping loose contact with it so she could feel the tension. The snow was to her knees in the open yard, higher in the drifts that had built against the fence line. She pushed through it. Her thighs burned with the effort immediately, the specific burn of muscles working against significant resistance, and she'd been strong her whole life, and she could feel the storm making arguments against that. She kept moving, 20 feet, 30. She was nearly at the rope's end when she felt it. A different resistance behind her, the rope going taut. She was at the limit. She stood at the end of 40 feet of rope in the middle of a blizzard and looked north at nothing and understood the choice in front of her with complete clarity. Go back to the cabin, or untie the rope. She thought about standing in the courthouse, the rope on her wrists, the silence when no one spoke, the specific loneliness of being in a room full of people who looked at her and decided she was not worth the trouble. She thought about a man who had walked into that room and signed his name and cut the rope and said, "Follow me home." She reached down and untied the knot. The 40 feet behind her disappeared into the storm. She marked direction by the wind's angle on her face and the slope of the ground underfoot and the partial memory of 3 months of walking these approaches in better weather. She was not certain of any of it. Certainty was not available in these conditions. She moved anyway. She found the tree line by walking into it. Her outstretched hand hit bark before she saw it, and she caught herself. got her bearings from the closeness of the trees which cut some of the wind's worst intent, and turned east along the slope the way she remembered the upper draw began. The forest was louder than the open ground in a strange way. The wind in the upper branches made a sustained sound like pressure building in something that was about to give, and snow fell from the disturbed branches in periodic cascades that landed on her shoulders and hat with the weight of accumulated failure. She pushed through it. Time stopped making sense. It probably hadn't been as long as it felt. She had been walking uphill in knee-deep snow in a blizzard for what felt like an hour, and was probably half of that, and she was beginning to have a genuine and sober conversation with herself about the possibility that she had made a catastrophically wrong decision when her boot hit something that wasn't snow. She stopped. She crouched down. Timber. Not a fallen tree. She knew fallen trees, had clambered over enough of them on these trails. The angle was wrong, and when she scraped snow away with her gloved hands, she found not the rough surface of natural fall, but the splintered break of something that had come down hard and fast, a dead trunk, undermined by the frozen ground, that had gone over in the wind with the violence of a thing that had been waiting for an excuse. Under it, half buried and face up in the packed snow, with his left leg at an angle that made her stomach clench, was Gideon. She said his name. The storm took the sound immediately. She said it again, closer, bending over him, and his eyes opened. Not all the way, not with full awareness, but enough. He looked at her with the confused, pain-narrowed expression of a man who has been unconscious and is not yet sure what reality he's returned to. Evelyn. His voice was almost nothing, a breath with shape. "Don't move your leg," she said. "There's timber on it. I'm going to get it off." "You can't." He stopped, breathed. It weighs." "Don't tell me what it weighs," she said. She stood up and found the end of the fallen trunk and assessed it. He was right that it was heavy. It was a dead pine, maybe 60 feet of it when it was standing, and the section across his leg was the base, dense, waterlogged, the heaviest part. She had no saw. She had no axe. She had the strength she'd been born with and the leverage of a branch she found 2 feet away in the snow, still attached at a fork to the main trunk, and physics, which did not care about blizzards or opinions. She positioned the branch fork under the timber section as close to his leg as she could manage. She found a smaller log. She had to feel for it with her hands in the snow, swearing steadily under her breath the entire time, because it was a critical piece and it took 45 seconds to find that felt like considerably longer, and set it as a fulcrum. She put her weight on the lever arm. The timber moved a 1/4 inch. She made a sound that was not a word, and was not quite a scream, and drove her entire body weight down on the branch with everything she had. Her boots lost purchase in the snow, and she scrambled and pushed and felt something shift in her shoulder that would hurt tomorrow in a way it was not hurting now, and the timber lifted. "Move," she said through her teeth. "Your good leg. Push yourself back. Now." She heard him moving, heard the hiss of breath through pain. She held the lever and felt the weight of the timber trembling through her hands and arms and back and kept it held. He cleared the leg. She released the lever and the timber dropped back into the snow with a concussive thud she felt in her teeth. She was on her knees in the snow beside him before the echo finished. His face was the color of the sky before the storm. Wrong, too pale, the pallor of a man who'd been lying in the cold long enough for the cold to make decisions about him. His left leg was bad. She could see it even through the trouser and the boot. The shape was wrong below the knee, the specific wrongness of bone that had moved from where it was meant to be. She didn't touch it yet. "Can you hear me?" she said. "Yes." Clearer now. Whatever fog the cold had put in him was burning off against the pain, which was terrible and also useful. "How long were you down?" "I don't," he breathed. "I was checking the last line. The tree came down in the wind, maybe an hour, maybe longer. An hour in this temperature with a broken leg." She did not say what she thought about that. "I'm going to get you up," she said. "Evelyn?" "Do not," she said. "Tell me I can't." He looked at her. His eyes, even now, even with the pain working in them, had that quality of level attention she'd seen the first day in the courthouse. He was still there, still thinking. "All right," he said. Getting him upright was not a graceful operation. It It was not a thing she could describe afterward without acknowledging that it was ugly and painful and exhausting in a way that exceeded her available adjectives. She got his arm over her shoulders and her arm around his back, and she pulled, and he pushed with his good leg, and they got him vertical, and his broken leg contacted the snow, and he made a sound she would not forget. Brief, involuntary, immediately suppressed, the sound of a man absorbing the maximum available amount of pain and choosing not to give the rest of it sound. And she held him. "Okay," she said. "Okay. We're going down." "Which way?" She looked at the storm, at the dark and the snow and the invisible distance between here and the cabin. "South and west," she said. "I'll count the slope." He could not walk. He could hop once on the good leg, and then he needed her to take his weight again. And what they did for the next, she estimated later, without confidence, 40 minutes, was a thing that did not have a clean name. Not walking, not carrying exactly. Something between, something improvised in the dark by two people who had no better options in a direction to move toward. She talked, some of the time. Not meaningfully. She said whatever came to her, the state of the woodpile, whether she thought the beans were better with the sage or without it, the fact that the fourth port shutter was going to need replacing entirely in spring, and she wanted him to know that before the weather turned. She talked because silence felt like surrender, and she was not interested in surrender. He was silent most of the time, which she understood as the sound of a man using everything he had for the task of staying upright. The cabin appeared out of the white before she expected it. The light from the fire she'd built too high and used too much wood on, was just barely visible through the front window, a smear of orange warmth in the storm, and she aimed at it. The porch steps, the door, inside. She got him to the floor near the fire because the bed was farther and she didn't have farther left in her. She went back and shut the door, which took more effort than it should have because her hands were not cooperating fully. She pulled off her outer layers and knelt beside him and started on his boot because the leg needed to come out of the boot before the swelling made it impossible, and he was going to hate this next part. "This is going to be bad," she said. "I know. Are you ready?" He braced himself with both hands flat on the floor. "Do it." She did it. He went the color of chalk and then the color of ash and didn't make a sound. And when it was done, she found his hand and held it for a moment and felt his pulse in it, fast but present, unambiguously present, and said, "The worst part's done." "You're lying," he said. "Yes," she said, "but not by much." The setting of it, later, was the thing she didn't talk about afterward in detail. She had seen it done once, by a doctor setting her father's wrist after a fall, and she understood the principle, if not the full practice. And she had no choice, and he had no choice, and she did what the situation required. She found 2 straight lengths of wood for the splint, and she used strips torn from the cleanest shirt she could find, and she worked by firelight with hands that would not stop shaking. And when it was done, it was not beautiful work, and she knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them said so. She built the fire to a proper heat and covered him with every blanket in the cabin and made broth from the last of the venison stock and got most of it into him before he lost the fight with consciousness and went somewhere she couldn't follow. She sat on the floor beside him and watched him breathe. The storm pressed against the walls of the cabin. The fire burned. Outside, the mountains did what mountains do. They continued, indifferent to the 2 people inside the small wooden structure at their feet, indifferent to whether those people made it through or didn't. She put her hand on his chest and felt his heart beating. She stayed there all night. By the 3rd day, the fever broke, which meant the 2 days before it had been the kind that made her doubt every decision and question every move she'd made in that storm. He burned and shook and said things that made no sense, names she didn't know, fragments of sentences from conversations she hadn't been part of. She kept the fever down with cold cloths, and kept the fire up for warmth, and kept the broth going, and slept in 1-hour intervals sitting in the chair she'd moved beside him. On the morning of the 4th day, he opened his eyes with clarity in them for the first time. He looked at the ceiling, then at her. She was in the chair, still, with a mending project in her lap that she hadn't been able to focus on for 2 days but had kept her hands busy. "You went out after me," he said. She looked up. "Yes. I told you not to." "You did." He was quiet for a moment, processing. She could see him assembling what he remembered: the tree, the cold, the dark, the improbable appearance of her face in the middle of a blizzard. "You untied the rope," he said. "The rope wasn't long enough." "Evelyn?" He said her name with a weight she hadn't heard in it before. Not reprimand, something else. "You could have died." "So could you," she said. "You nearly did." He looked at the ceiling again. Outside the window, the storm had finally exhausted itself, and the morning was the clean white and blue of a sky that had finished what it came to do. The light came through the east window and lay across the floor in a long rectangle. "The timber," he said. "On my leg. How did you—" "Leave her," she said, and I was very angry. He turned his head to look at her again. She met his eyes. His expression was doing something complicated. The face of a man encountering an emotion he doesn't entirely have a file for. "You carried me," he said. "Most of the way. I'm not a small man." "No," she agreed. "You're really not." Something happened at the corners of his eyes. Not what she'd seen before. Not the almost smile of a man remembering how humor works. Something deeper than that. Something that had been held in place a long time and was very slowly releasing its grip. He reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. The fire burned and the light moved across the floor, and outside the cabin the mountains stood exactly as they had always stood, unchanged and enormous and completely unconcerned. And inside it, two people sat in the particular silence of something that had shifted between them in the dark, and was only now, in the light, being acknowledged. Recovery, Evelyn discovered, was its own kind of weather system. The first week after the fever broke was the calm after. Gideon conscious and clear-eyed and present, but reduced in a way she hadn't seen him before. Not broken. Reduced. Like a fire that's still genuinely burning but has come down from its highest point to something more sustainable. He slept more than he was awake. He ate what she brought him without argument, which was itself a measure of how badly the storm had taken something out of him, because in the previous months she had never once seen him accept help without at least a token gesture toward not needing it. He did not, to his credit, pretend the leg wasn't serious. She'd been worried about that. She'd expected the particular stubbornness of a man who lives alone and has learned to treat his own injuries with the same brisk practicality he applies to everything else, minimizing, pushing through, converting pain into inconvenience through sheer force of will. She'd seen her father do it, and she'd seen Gerald do it, and she'd seen it cost both of them more than the original injury warranted. Gideon looked at his leg on the morning of the 5th day, when she unwrapped it for inspection and the bruising had reached its full expression in purples and greens across the shin, and said, "That's worse than I thought." "Yes," she said. "Is it set right?" She had asked herself this question approximately 40 times in the preceding days. "I think so. The angle looks like it's holding, but I'm not a doctor." "No." He looked at it a moment longer. "Closest doctor is in Blackstone Ridge." "I know." "I'm not riding to Blackstone Ridge." "I know that too." He looked at her. "You're not going to argue with me about it? Would it help?" He thought about it honestly, which was a thing she'd come to expect from him. He didn't answer rhetorical questions rhetorically. "No," he said. "Then I won't waste the effort." She rewrapped the leg with the clean strips of linen she'd been rotating through, working carefully around the splint. "If it starts showing signs of going bad, I'll tell you and we'll revisit the question. Until then, you stay off it, you keep it elevated when you're resting, and you don't try to help me with the woodpile, which I know you're thinking about." He had in fact been thinking about the woodpile. She'd seen him eyeing the window toward the woodshed that morning, with the expression of a man calculating distances and weighing them against his current mobility. "The woodpile is—" "I'll manage the woodpile," she said. "I've been managing it since the storm." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been carrying it in yourself." "It's not far." "Evelyn?" His voice had that particular weight she'd first heard when he said her name on the morning after she'd brought him in from the storm. Something in it that was still finding its shape. "That's not— You shouldn't have to do all of that." "I'm not doing it because I have to," she said, without looking up from her work. "I'm doing it because the fire needs wood, and you can't carry it right now and I can. That's the whole calculation." He watched her finish the wrapping. She could feel him watching, which was a sensation she had grown accustomed to over the months. In the way you grow accustomed to something that is not uncomfortable but that you remain aware of. The steady quality of his attention, the way he paid it without demanding anything in return. "I'm not good at this," he said. She looked up. "At what?" "Having someone—" He stopped, started differently. "Letting someone do things for me." "I know," she said. "You're getting better at it." Something crossed his face. Not quite embarrassment. The expression of a man who has been accurately described by someone who knows him well enough to do it, and who is not sure whether to be uncomfortable or grateful for that. "The others," she said, "who knew you in the mountains, they said you were dangerous. Some of them. Were they wrong?" He didn't answer immediately. She waited. "I've done things that earned the word," he said. "I was a different kind of man before I came up here." He paused. "I didn't like that man much, so I went somewhere he couldn't follow." She considered this. "Did it work?" "Mostly," he said. "Some things follow you whether you move or not." She sat back in the chair she'd positioned beside his bed. Her chair, the one he'd built her, which she'd moved in here during the worst of the fever and hadn't moved back yet. The morning light was in the window and the cabin was warm, and outside the January cold was a fact rather than a crisis, which was an improvement. "I know something about things that follow you," she said. He looked at her, and that was how it started. Not with a decision to speak, not with a deliberate choosing of the moment, but with the specific atmosphere of two people in a warm room in the aftermath of surviving something together, where the usual reasons to stay guarded had temporarily lost their argument. She told him about her mother first. Not the death, she'd mentioned that early on, but the before. The way her mother had been a woman who took up exactly as much space as the world allotted her and never argued for more, and how Evelyn had watched this as a child and understood it as a model, and then spent the rest of her childhood trying not to follow it because something in her had always been larger than the space she was being offered, and she hadn't known what to do with that. She told him about her father, who had loved her genuinely and specifically, who had called her his mountain girl and meant it as a compliment, and who had also, when the pressure of other people's opinions about his tall, broad-shouldered daughter became loud enough, sometimes gone quiet in ways that cost her more than his words ever would have. She told him about the 2 years with Gerald. She didn't frame it dramatically. She said it in the flat, practical tone she'd have used to describe the winter provision situation. This happened, and then this happened, and then this. Because that was the only way she could say it without it becoming a thing she couldn't finish. Gerald had not been the worst kind of man. He had been, in some ways, a worse thing than the worst kind of man. He had been an indifferent one. He had looked at her and seen an expense that exceeded her value, and the specific cruelty of that was not something she had found a comfortable place to carry. Gideon listened without interrupting. He didn't make the sounds people made when they were performing sympathy. The murmurs, the head tilts, the expressions that meant, "I am showing you that I feel this." He just listened, in the way that she'd noticed was either his great quality or his great limitation depending on the situation, but in this situation was exactly right. When she finished, not with any particular conclusion, just arriving at the courtroom and stopping there because he'd been in the courtroom himself and knew the rest, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had a wife." She hadn't expected it. She kept her face still. "Her name was Clara," he said. "We had a son, Thomas. He was 4 years old." He said this with the specific flatness of words that have been said before. In the interior, many times. So many times that the saying of them has worn the surface smooth, made them possible to produce without immediate collapse. But underneath the flatness, she could hear the shape of what they contained. "We lived outside of Millhaven, on the Eastern Plain. I did some work that wasn't always clean. I knew men I shouldn't have known. One of them had a dispute with another man who had a dispute with me, and the chain of it came back to my house on a November night when I wasn't home." Evelyn sat very still. "I was in town," he said. "I came back and the house was—" He stopped. The flatness cracked. Not dramatically, just a hairline, but she heard it. "Clara didn't survive it. Thomas did, but he was hurt. He lived with my sister in the East after that. He'd be 10 now." He looked at the window. I see him when I can, which isn't often enough, and the distance is my fault, and that's something I carry every day. The fire shifted. Outside, a branch somewhere dropped its accumulated snow with a sound like a book falling. I came up here because I needed to be somewhere I couldn't hurt anyone else by existing near them, he said. That's the honest version. That's a terrible reason to isolate yourself, she said. He looked at her. I don't mean... She stopped, tried again. I understand the impulse. I know what it is to believe that your presence costs other people more than it gives them. But you were wrong. People died because of me. People died because of the men who made those choices, she said. Not the same thing. Evelyn, I'm not saying you carry nothing. I'm saying you carried the wrong man's share of it up here and added it to your own, and that's a lot of weight for 6 years. She said it plainly, not gently. She had learned that he received plain better than gentle. And I'm also saying that your son is 10 years old and growing up without his father in the mountains because his father decided he didn't deserve to be near good things. And I think that's the part you should probably argue with. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence they'd built over the winter. It was the live wire kind, the kind that has something running through it. She thought she'd pushed too far. She was aware she often pushed to a point that made people defensive, and she braced for it. Instead, he said very quietly, I write to him. Every month. That's not the same as being there. No, he said. It isn't. He looked at the ceiling. I know that. She didn't push further. She'd said the thing. Saying it twice would only be punishment. They sat in the changed air of the room for a while, and the fire burned and the morning moved, and something between them that had been building with the patience of slow water had arrived. Finally, at the edge it had been moving toward. He was on his feet. Carefully, with the crutch he'd fashioned himself from a forked branch, she'd brought him, because if she was going to allow him limited mobility, she was at least going to ensure he had the right equipment for it, by the end of the 3rd week. He moved around the cabin with the deliberate economy of a man rewiring his sense of his own body's capability, learning what it would do now and what it would not, making the adjustments without complaint but also without pretending they weren't required. He took back the fire maintenance first because she let him have it. Then the small repairs he could manage from a seated position. He sat at the table and sharpened every blade in the cabin until they were in better condition than they'd probably been since new, which was not a task that needed doing, but which needed doing for him, specifically in the way that men who are accustomed to useful labor need to be useful even when their options are limited. She didn't comment on it. She just found the next thing that needed doing and did it herself. And they moved around each other in the cabin's small space with the specific efficiency of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms well enough to stop performing and just function. He started talking more. It happened the way most things happened with Gideon. Not announced, just present one day in a way it hadn't been the day before. He told her about the mountains, about the seasons and what they each required, about the trap lines and the best years and the bad ones. He told her things about the land she hadn't asked, but that he apparently wanted her to know, as if he were adding her name to a deed she hadn't known was being offered. She told him things, too, about what she'd been good at before Gerald's house, the way her father had taught her to read the weather, the time she'd helped a neighbor deliver a calf at midnight in a hailstorm and hadn't panicked, the wildflower book she still kept in her trunk, and the reason she'd started it, which was so ordinary and personal she hadn't told anyone about it in years. Why wildflowers? He asked. On an evening when she'd taken the book out and was adding a pressed stem she'd found dried under the snow at the woodshed, a remnant of late autumn that had survived into January in improbable condition. My mother used to name them for me when I was small, she said. She knew all of them. I didn't want to forget which was which after she died. She smoothed the stem onto the page. It's a small thing. It's not small, he said. She looked up. Keeping something because it connects you to someone you lost, he said, slowly, as if working out whether the words were right before committing to them. That's not small. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she looked back at the book. No, she said. I suppose it isn't. The wolves came on a Thursday night in the deep end of February. She heard them first, not the distant sound that sometimes drifted down from the upper range, but close, immediate. The sound of animals that had found something interesting and were discussing what to do about it. She was awake because she slept lightly in winter, a habit formed from months of monitoring the fire, and she heard them and was out of bed and at the window before the sound fully resolved into what it was. 3 of them, maybe 4, at the edge of the yard near the woodshed. The moonlight was good, and she could see them as moving shadows just at the boundary of the tree line, gray dark shapes, patient in the way that hungry things are patient when they've found a fixed target. The chickens. There were 4 of them in the small coop attached to the woodshed, 4 chickens that Gideon had acquired in autumn from a passing trader that produced eggs unreliably but produced them, and which represented a meaningful share of their protein through the winter months. She heard Gideon behind her. He moved fast for a man with a healing leg and a crutch, which she noted even in the moment. "How many?" he said at the window beside her. 3 I can see. Maybe more. They're after the coop. Yes. He was already reaching for the rifle on its pegs above the door. Then he stopped. She watched his face. He was calculating his own mobility. The snow in the yard was deep, the ground was uneven, and his left leg was better than it had been, but was not what he'd need it to be to maintain footing in uncertain conditions while managing a firearm. He knew it. She could see him knowing it. "Give it to me," she said. "Evelyn, you taught me to load it 2 weeks ago. I know how it works." She met his eyes. "Give it to me and tell me where to stand." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd seen in the storm, the moment of recalibrating what she was capable of, the slight internal adjustment of a man updating his understanding. He handed her the rifle. "East side of the porch," he said. "You want the angle from the corner. Don't go into the yard. The footing is bad and you need to be stationary to shoot straight. I'll take the shotgun and come out behind you. If they rush, make noise first, and if that doesn't stop them—" "I know what to do if it doesn't stop them," she said. "I know you do." He picked up the shotgun and checked it. "I just like to hear the plan out loud." She pulled on her boots and her coat and stepped out onto the porch, and the cold arrived immediately and absolutely. The February cold that meant business. She moved to the east corner and set herself there with the rifle up and found the animals with her eye across the site in the moonlight. They were moving toward the coop. 4 of them. She could count now. Large. The winter had been hard, and they were lean in the way that made lean things more dangerous, not less. She fired once, into the snow 6 feet in front of the lead animal. The sound in the cold night air was enormous, physical. A concussion that hit the tree line and came back. The wolves stopped. She heard Gideon come out onto the porch behind her. The shotgun. He fired into the air, and the second explosion rolled out across the yard and up into the dark. The wolves broke. Not in panic. That wasn't how they moved. In the calculating way of animals that have assessed the situation and arrived at a new calculation. They pulled back to the tree line, and she watched them through the sight. 3 shapes, and then 2, and then nothing. The tree line simply dark again. She stood with the rifle at her shoulder for another 30 seconds. Then she lowered it. Gideon was at the corner of the porch behind her, leaning on the support post with the shotgun loose in his hands and his breath visible in the cold. "They're gone," she said. "For tonight. We should reinforce the coop door in the morning." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. Not surprised, she'd surprised him before, and she knew what that looked like. Something that had been building in him longer than this moment and had arrived here. "Come inside," she said. "You've been on that leg too long." She moved past him to the door. His hand caught her arm. Not grabbing, just a touch, brief, at her sleeve. And she stopped. She turned. He was looking at her with the moonlight on his face and the particular expression of a man who has something to say and has been carrying it for a considerable time and has arrived, finally, at the point where the carrying is more costly than the saying. "I need to tell you something," he said. The cold was very present. The mountain was very quiet now that the sound of the shots had faded. She stood on the porch and looked at him and waited. "I don't know how to say it in a way that doesn't sound—" He stopped. The contained man, the man of flat, deliberate words, was not contained right now. Something had come loose. "I've been trying to find the right way to say it for about 6 weeks, and I haven't found it yet, so I'm just going to say it plainly, and you can tell me if it's unwelcome." "Say it," she said. "I love you," he said. "Not because of the storm. Not because you pulled me out of the dark. Though you did, and I know it. Because of who you are every ordinary day. The way you fixed the porch step before I knew it needed fixing. The way you said, don't tell me what it weighs and then move the weight. The way you keep that book like it matters, because it does. He stopped. His jaw was tight, not with anger, but with the effort of someone who has opened something and cannot now close it. I've been alone a long time because I thought I was supposed to be. I don't think that anymore. Evelyn stood still in the cold and looked at him and felt the thing she'd been managing for weeks. The careful, disciplined, very sensible containment of what she'd noticed and refused to name release its hold all at once, quietly, like a knot worked loose from the inside. I fell in love with you, she said, the day you cut the rope. He looked at her. Not because you rescued me, she said, because you looked at me and saw a person. I had forgotten what that felt like. She breathed. I've known what I felt for a while now. I was waiting to see if you were going to say it first because I wasn't sure you knew how. Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically. Gideon did nothing dramatically. But the lines of containment around his eyes released, and what was underneath was something raw and real, and not at all the composed man of the mountains that Blackstone Ridge had made their cautionary story about. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, bad leg and all. And when she put her arms around him and felt him put his around her, it was not the embrace of a graceful moment in a story. It was the embrace of 2 people who had been in the cold for a long time, and had finally, against most of the available evidence, found warmth. They stood on the porch in February with the wolves somewhere in the trees, and the fire waiting inside, and the mountains rising enormous and indifferent all around them. And she held on to him and he held on to her, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said. The wedding was not a grand occasion. There was no time that was right for a grand occasion, practically speaking, and neither of them was particularly built for ceremony. Gideon's leg was still healing. The mountain roads were still difficult. The wildflowers that Evelyn might have wanted were 3 months from existing. What there was, on a Saturday in late March, when the worst of winter had finally let go and the first pale green was visible on the south-facing slopes, was a small chapel in Blackstone Ridge that had a minister who asked no difficult questions and 2 witnesses who were the general store owner and his wife, both of whom looked at the couple in front of them with the particular expression of people watching something that contradicts the story they were told. Evelyn wore her better dress and her mother's ring on her right hand, which she moved to her left that morning and which fit the way she'd always known it would if she ever had occasion to put it there. Gideon wore his less worn coat and had made an effort with his beard, which she'd told him was unnecessary and which she privately appreciated. They stood in front of the minister and said the words and meant them, which was, she thought, the entire point of words in the first place. Afterward, walking out of the chapel into the early spring light, Gideon offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked to where Samson was tied at the rail, and Gideon untied him, and they stood there for a moment in the street of the town that had once gathered to watch her be given away like surplus. Nobody laughed. Nobody said anything at all, actually. A few people on the main street looked and looked away. A woman she didn't recognize watched from in front of the dry goods store with an expression that might have been curiosity and might have been something else. "You want to go back inside?" Gideon said quietly. "Get something to eat before the ride back?" Evelyn looked at the town. At the courthouse at the far end of the main street, its oak door closed. At the ordinary, indifferent life of Blackstone Ridge moving around her on a Saturday morning, entirely unbothered by the fact that the wrong it had been part of had not destroyed her. "No," she said. "I want to go home." He mounted, and she took his hand and mounted behind him, settling into the familiar position on the bedroll behind the saddle where she'd ridden 14 miles on the first day, knowing nothing about what waited at the end of it. She knew now. She put her arms around him, and Samson moved north out of Blackstone Ridge, steady and unhurried, the way he moved everywhere, and the mountains came toward them in the distance the way they always did, enormous and certain and entirely themselves. She didn't look back. There was nothing back there she needed. Spring came to the mountain the way it always did. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by 3 days of late snow, mud that froze overnight and thawed again by noon. The first green on the south slopes appearing and disappearing and appearing again, more insistent each time, until by mid-April the argument was settled and the mountain accepted the season the way it accepted everything, without comment, simply by becoming it. Evelyn noticed the spring differently that year. She had spent the previous one at Gerald's, where the season meant more work without more help. The kitchen garden that she planted and tended and harvested largely alone, the fences that needed walking after the thaw, the sense of increasing labor without any corresponding sense of building toward something. Spring at Gerald's was just winter with mud added. Spring on the mountain was something else. The wildflowers came first on the eastern slope below the cabin, the same slope where she'd found the dried stem in January, now offering the living version in pale yellow and white. She recognized them from her book, and it was a strange, specific pleasure, like meeting in person someone you'd only ever read letters from. She pressed new specimens alongside the old ones, and the book, already thick, grew thicker. Gideon's leg healed with the season. Not perfectly. Nothing about that winter had concluded perfectly. But functionally, which was what mattered on a working homestead. He walked with a slight hitch on cold mornings that she didn't think would entirely leave him, and he'd accepted this with the same flat practicality he applied to most permanent things. Acknowledged it, adjusted for it, moved on. She noticed him doing the same inventory she'd seen him do after the storm, recalculating what his body could and couldn't do now, redistributing accordingly, and she gave him the space to do it without commentary, because commentary wasn't what he needed, and she knew the difference. What the homestead needed, they both understood by April, was more than the two of them had been managing it with. "The North Field," Gideon said one evening, spreading a rough map on the table that he'd drawn himself, the lines of it bearing the confident inaccuracy of a man who knew the land by body rather than by measurement. "If we clear the timberline back another 30 feet, we can get grain in by June. Enough to carry us through next winter without buying from town." Evelyn looked at the map. "That's a lot of clearing for 2 people." "I know. You can't swing an axe yet, not properly." "I know that too." He wasn't defensive about it. That was one of the things that had changed in him since January. Or maybe not changed, maybe just become visible. The same way spring made visible things that had been there all winter under the snow. He'd gotten quieter about his own pride. Not eliminated it. It was still there. The pride of a capable man temporarily reduced, but he held it differently. Less like a wall and more like something he was aware of and occasionally set aside. "I can manage the team if we had one. Pulling stumps is faster with a horse and chain than with axes anyway." Michel. "We don't have a team. We don't have one yet." He looked at her with the particular expression she'd come to know as his version of optimism, which was less effusive than other people's versions but more reliable. "There's a man in the East Valley, Harmon Briggs, who sells draft horses. I've done business with him before. He's reasonable." "Is he now?" she said. "Reasonably reasonable." "That's a different standard." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'll ride out next week, see what he has." She looked at the map. At the north field marked out in Gideon's rough lines, the timber boundary, the slope of the land she'd been walking for months, and knew better now than she'd known any ground she'd ever stood on. She thought about grain enough to carry them through winter without the long rides down to Blackstone Ridge in the cold. She thought about the root cellar that needed expanding, the kitchen garden that could go another 30 feet east if she had the time, the second coop she'd been considering because 4 chickens were not sufficient for 2 people with any ambition about eggs. She thought about what it felt like to plan for a future she expected to be in. It had been a long time since she'd been able to do that. "Get 2 horses," she said. "If Briggs is reasonable, get 2. Thomas arrived in July. She'd known he was coming. Gideon had written to his sister in May, the letter taking 3 weeks each way, and when the reply came with the boy's agreement, she'd watched Gideon read it twice and then set it down and look at the window for a long time without speaking. She'd left him to it. There were things happening in him during that reading that needed room and not company. She'd asked, the following morning, "When does he arrive?" "Sometime in July. Margaret will bring him as far as the Ridge Road. I'll meet them there." He'd paused. "I want you to know, he doesn't know much about you. I didn't know how to explain in a letter. You could have said you got married." "I did say that." He'd looked at her with the expression she'd classified, over the months, as his version of helplessness, which looked on his face not like helplessness, but like a man standing in a room where none of the furniture is where he expected it to be. "I didn't know how to explain the rest." "There isn't that much rest to explain," she said. "I'm Evelyn. I live here. We'll figure out the rest when he gets here." He'd nodded as if this were simpler than he'd made it. which it was, and which he probably knew, and which had nevertheless required someone else to say out loud. Thomas was 10 years old and small for it, with his father's coloring and a watchful quality in his eyes that was both entirely Gideon and entirely the product of a child who had experienced the specific education of early loss. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon riding behind his Aunt Margaret on a dun mare, and when he slid down from the horse and stood in the yard of the cabin and looked at everything around him, the structure, the garden, the north field now cleared and planted, the draft horses in the new paddock, Evelyn standing on the porch, he had the expression of someone revising an expectation he'd arrived with. Gideon crouched down to his level, bad leg and all, and said something to him quietly that Evelyn couldn't hear from the porch. She watched Thomas listen and nod once, and then look past his father at her again. She came down the porch steps and crossed the yard and stopped a few feet away. "You're Thomas," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Evelyn. Your father's told me about you." She crouched to his level, too, which put her at roughly his height, which was a thing she'd learned in her own childhood, that being crouched down to rather than looked down at was a different experience in a way that mattered. "Are you hungry? I made biscuits this morning, and there are enough left that you can eat 3 without it being impolite." Something shifted in his face. The watchfulness didn't leave. She suspected it didn't leave quickly in him. It would take time, possibly a lot of it, but something under it moved. "I could eat 3, he said. "Good," she said. "Come inside." Margaret stayed 2 days before the ride back east, and in those 2 days Evelyn watched her watch the homestead with the careful eyes of a woman trying to assess whether her nephew would be all right here. She didn't resent the assessment. She understood it. She answered questions directly when asked, and didn't perform warmth she didn't feel and didn't suppress the warmth she did. And on the morning of Margaret's departure, the woman took her hand and held it briefly and said, "He needs to know what a family looks like." "I know," Evelyn said. "You'll be patient with him." "I'll be honest with him," she said. "I find it works better than patience alone." Margaret looked at her for a moment, then nodded with the expression of someone who has been reassured in a way they didn't expect. Thomas stayed. He was not an easy child, and she'd never expected him to be. He was quiet in a way that had walls in it, and he tested her in the small particular ways of a child who has been hurt and needs to know, before he will believe anything, whether the people around him will stay or leave. He lost things deliberately and watched her reaction. He pushed back on small rules to see what happened when he did. He asked Gideon questions designed to catch him in inconsistencies, not from malice, but from the deeply practical instinct of a child who has learned that adults are not always what they present themselves as. She let him test. She didn't take it personally, which was harder than it sounds. There were mornings when the deliberate difficulty of him landed somewhere tender in her, and she had to go outside and breathe cold air for 10 minutes before coming back in. But she came back in, and she didn't change the rules on the days he pushed them, and she didn't pretend his testing wasn't happening, which seemed to confuse him initially, and then slowly to mean something to him. The shift happened, as shifts usually did, without announcement. It was a Saturday in August, 3 weeks into Thomas's stay, and she was pressing a new wildflower specimen into the book at the table, and he came and stood beside her and looked at it without being invited to. "What is that one?" he said. "Fireweed," she said. "Grows after ground's been disturbed. Fires, mostly, sometimes just where the soil's been turned. It's one of the first things that comes back." He looked at the page, at the other specimens around it. The pressed yellows and whites of spring, the purple and blue of early summer, the whole accumulating record of a mountain year. "You have a lot of them," he said. "I've been collecting them since I was about your age." She turned a few pages to the older specimens, the ones that had been in the book since before she came to the mountain, the ones her mother had named. "My mother taught me which was which. I didn't want to forget." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother liked birds." She kept very still. He hadn't mentioned his mother before. "Do you know which ones she liked?" she asked. "The red ones," he said. "Cardinals. She said they were the only birds that looked like they'd been painted on purpose." "That's a good description," Evelyn said. He looked at the book a moment longer. "Can I put one in?" he said. "If I find one?" She slid the book toward him. "When you find one," she said. "Not if." He picked the book up carefully, with both hands, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else and might matter to them. and looked at the pages for a while. Then he set it back down gently and went outside, and she watched him through the window walk toward the field where the fireweed grew in a long purple corridor along the north fence line, crouching here and there, looking. She went back to her work. She didn't say anything about it to Gideon that evening. Some things didn't need to be reported. Some things just needed to be let happen. The years that followed were not simple. She would have been suspicious of them if they had been. There were winters that took more than expected and summers that gave less. A crop failure in the third year that required 3 months of strict rationing and one long, humbling trip to Blackstone Ridge for supplies on credit, which Gideon paid back in furs the following spring, and which neither of them mentioned again afterward because there was no useful reason to. A sickness that moved through the Mountain families one November, not fatal, but lasting, leaving everyone in the cabin fatigued and short-tempered for 3 weeks in a way that resulted in at least 2 arguments she wasn't proud of, and one that she was, because it cleared something that had needed clearing. She and Gideon did not have the marriage of people in stories. They had the marriage of people who were both carrying their histories into a shared space, and sometimes the histories took up too much room. He went silent in ways that frustrated her when she needed him present. She pushed in ways that frustrated him when he needed time. They learned over years which of these were fundamental and which were negotiable, and they negotiated the negotiable ones with varying degrees of grace depending on the season and the state of the provisions and how much sleep either of them had gotten. They also had a daughter. Anna came in the 4th year in early spring, which Evelyn had not entirely planned but had not been unprepared to consider. The birth was not easy. She was not young for a first birth, and the mountain was not close to a doctor, and Gideon spent 8 of the 12 hours in a state of contained terror that he managed with the same discipline he applied to everything that frightened him, which was to keep his hands busy and his voice level and his opinions about the situation to himself. Anna arrived furious and loud and red-faced, and Evelyn held her in the early morning light of the cabin and felt something that she didn't have a word for that was large enough, something that had no language because it was older than language, the specific acknowledgement of the self in another face, the understanding that she had made a life that was making another one. Gideon sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who has just had something confirmed that he hadn't let himself fully believe until this moment. "She's angry," he said. "She's perfect," Evelyn said. "She's both," he said, and he held out one finger, and Anna, with the blind, furious certainty of the newly arrived, grabbed it. Thomas, 10 now, and accustomed to the homestead, and to both of them in the way that had taken time to build, and was the more solid for it, appeared in the doorway and looked at his sister with an expression that cycled through several feelings in quick succession before settling on something that looked, if not enthusiastic, at least genuinely interested. "She's small," he said. "You were small once," Gideon said. "I don't remember that." "No one does," Evelyn said. "Come and meet her." He crossed the room and looked down at the baby in her arms with the serious consideration he gave most things, and Anna, as if sensing scrutiny, opened her eyes briefly and looked in the general direction of his face. "Hello," Thomas said to the baby quietly, like he wasn't sure she could hear him. She closed her eyes again. "She's not very responsive," he said. "Give her a few years," Evelyn said. The years gave Anna a personality that had elements of both her parents and had combined them in a configuration that belonged entirely to her, which was how it usually went. She was direct like her mother and observant like her father, and had inherited some version of the stubbornness that both of them carried, concentrated, which made her particular to manage in her adolescence and formidable in her adulthood. Thomas grew into a man who came back to the mountain whenever he could, which was regularly enough to matter. He had his father's skill with the land and something that was his own, an ease with people that neither of his parents had fully possessed, a quality of putting strangers at their comfort that Evelyn watched with a kind of amazed recognition, understanding that it was the hard-won product of a child who'd had to learn very early how to read a room and had converted that skill, over time, into genuine warmth. He married a woman named Ruth who had opinions and stated them, which Evelyn approved of immediately, and Gideon took several months to fully appreciate and then came around on entirely. The cabin expanded. Not dramatically, they were not dramatic people, but room by room as need arrived and means permitted. The kitchen grew. A second sleeping room went on the east side when Anna stopped accepting shared space with any grace whatsoever, which happened at 14 and showed no sign of reversing. The porch was rebuilt properly with new boards and a rail that didn't lean, and Evelyn stood back and looked at it on the day it was finished, and thought about the gap she'd fallen through on her fourth morning here, and felt something that was not quite sentiment and not quite satisfaction, but somewhere between the two. The afternoon she remembered longest happened in the autumn of a year when both children were grown, and the homestead was full of the specific quiet of a place that had done its hardest work and was now in its steady season. Gideon had suggested a walk up to the ridge above the cabin, the long ridge that faced south and in clear weather showed the full sweep of the valley below, the river a silver thread in the distance, the smaller homesteads visible as cleared patches in the timber. He suggested it casually, the way he suggested most things that mattered to him, but she knew his casual, had known it for many years, and she put on her coat and her good boots and went. The climb took longer than it used to. His leg was what it was on cold days, and she was not the 24-year-old woman who had ridden out of Blackstone Ridge on the back of a horse with everything she owned in a trunk and no certainty about anything. They were not old, she refused that word, found it imprecise, but they were not young either, and the mountain reminded them of this in the way that mountains reminded people of most things, without sentiment, simply by being what it was. They reached the ridge and stood in the late afternoon light and looked south. The valley was exactly what it had always been. The river, the cleared patches, the sky enormous and blue in the particular way of autumn sky that had no clouds in it, the kind of blue that looks painted and isn't. Gideon stood beside her with his hands in his coat pockets and was quiet for a while in the way she'd long ago stopped reading as absence and understood as presence, the particular presence of a man who was fully where he was and didn't need to fill it with words. "I think about that courthouse sometimes," he said. She looked at him. "Not often," he said, "but sometimes." "What do you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, working toward it honestly, the way he'd always done. "I think about what I nearly didn't do," he said. "I stood in the back of that room for 10 minutes before I moved. I almost left." She looked at him. This was new information. In all the years, he'd never said that. "What stopped you?" she said. He turned to look at her, and on his face was the expression she'd learned to read as his deepest register. Not the surface efficiency or the middle-distance patience, but the thing underneath those, the man that had existed before the mountains and had survived inside them and had finally, slowly, been given enough safety to come back out. "You weren't crying," he said. "Everyone in that room was either laughing or pitying you, and you were just standing there, looking at the wall, like you'd decided that whatever they did, they weren't getting the satisfaction of watching you fall apart." He paused. "I'd never seen anything like it. I wanted to know who you were." She looked at him for a long moment. "I was looking at a water stain," she said, "shaped like a boot." He blinked. "Near the window," she said. "I needed something to look at that wasn't a person." Something happened on his face. Then he laughed. Not the almost laugh she'd first seen years ago, but the real thing, the full version, the laugh of a man who had gotten enough of his life back to have access to it again. It was not a graceful sound. It was real, which was better. She laughed too. They stood on the ridge and laughed at the water stain and the boot and the courthouse and the November morning that had started everything. And below them the valley lay in its autumn light, indifferent and beautiful and entirely unconcerned with the two people above it who had made their lives in the shadow of its mountains. When the laughter settled, she put her arm through his, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood like that for a while, looking south. She thought about the voices, the men in the courthouse, Morton Webb, and his opinion about what she cost to feed, the young man with his loud arithmetic about winter stores, Gerald's expression, finished, done, setting down a burden. The silence when the judge raised his gavel and there was no one. She had thought, at one point in the years after, that she would want something from them, an accounting, some form of return on the debt. She'd been wrong about that, and it had taken longer than she'd like to admit to understand why. The wanting of an accounting kept you attached to the thing you wanted accounting for. It kept you in that courthouse, in that room, with the rope on your wrists and the silence around you. The only way to leave it was to actually leave, not to go back and prove anything, not to return in triumph and stand over the people who had been wrong about you, but to simply be elsewhere, building elsewhere, letting the elsewhere become so real and full and demanding of your presence that the courthouse became what it actually was, a Tuesday morning in a town she'd passed through once. Blackstone Ridge had not changed because she had. That was not how places worked. The men who had laughed probably told the story the way men told stories they were the center of, with whatever revisions made them comfortable. Gerald had probably found another arrangement for his practical problems. The courthouse still had the water stain near the window, most likely, and nobody thought about it. She had a daughter who argued with her about everything important and agreed with her about the things that mattered. She had a stepson who came home and brought Ruth, and eventually brought children who called her grandmother in voices loud enough to reach the mountain's upper range. She had a kitchen that smelled like sage, and a wildflower book so thick it barely closed, and a porch built right the first time, and a man beside her who had walked into a room once because something in him refused to leave it the way he found it. She had been told, in every available language that the people around her could deploy, that she was too much, too large, too expensive, too present, too difficult to accommodate. She had been offered, at the lowest point of her life, at zero cost to anyone willing to take on the trouble of her existence. The trouble of her existence had built a homestead from a deteriorating cabin, had carried a man out of a blizzard, had pressed wildflowers into a book and raised 2 children and negotiated 20 years of winters and laughed on a ridge in the autumn light about a water stain shaped like a boot. She was not too much. She had simply been in the wrong rooms. Gideon's hand tightened slightly over hers. She looked at him. He was looking south still, at the valley, but something in his profile was peaceful in a way that had taken years to arrive at, and that she did not take for granted, because she knew what it had cost him and what it had taken to stop paying for the wrong things. "We should go back down," he said. "Anna said dinner at 5. "Anna always says dinner at 5 and means 6, Evelyn said. "I know. I like having the extra hour." She looked at the valley one more time. The river, the light. The ordinary, extraordinary fact of an afternoon in which nothing terrible was happening, and she was standing somewhere she had chosen, and the future existed in the direction she was already walking. "All right," she said. "Let's go home." They turned from the ridge and started back down the mountain together, not quickly. There was no need for quickly. Moving at the pace of people who know the ground under their feet and trust it, through the trees that were turning in the autumn air, toward the lights of the cabin visible below through the timber, warm and specific in theirs. Behind them, the ridge held its view for no one in particular. Ahead, the path went down. They followed it.